I was debating the logic of U.S. foreign policy with a historian friend the other night, specifically focusing on the endless cycle of interventions in Latin America. I expected the usual cynical take arguments about oil, corporate interests, or the dry strategic calculus of realpolitik. I was ready for him to point to a map and talk about resource extraction, but then the conversation took a strange, almost spiritual turn. When I mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, he didn't bring up economics or national security. Instead, he started talking about the Puritans. He described the U.S. not as a nation-state, but as a new Zion, a theological project born from religious outcasts like the Anabaptists and Mennonites who felt they had failed in Europe. His tone shifted from academic to something more intense. He argued that the concept of manifest destiny wasn't just political propaganda. It was a literal belief that the U.S. is the spirit of the world, a light that must consume the darkness. It was fascinating and slightly unsettling to watch him trace a direct line from 17th century religious sects to modern military strategy.
He suggested that the drive to control the hemisphere isn't about protecting borders, but about maintaining a divine mandate to be the antithesis of Europe. That perspective completely reframed the issue for me. It suggests that when we look at U.S. actions in the region, from the big stick to the containment of China, we aren't watching a secular government protecting its interests. We are watching a secularized religious crusade that believes it is the only valid form of civilization.
That is a fascinating story. And, that really gets right to the absolute core of what we're deep diving into today. We're talking about the political and, maybe more importantly, the theological origins of American exceptionalism. It's this belief, this deep-seated idea that the U.S. is somehow qualitatively different from every other nation.
That it has this unique role to play, a sacred mission almost.
A sacred mission, exactly. And what's wild is how live this concept still is. I mean, it's not some dusty historical theory. The term's usage has just exploded in recent years.
It has. I saw a figure, something like between 2010 and 2012, it appeared over 4,000 times in U.S. publications alone.
4,172 times, to be precise. It's just staggering. It shows you how activated this idea is in our modern political conversations.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're looking at, 4 centuries of history here? We're going from Puritan covenants all the way to modern foreign policy.
And we're going to structure it around these key milestones. Winthrop's original speech, then Manifest Destiny, Wilsonianism.
And then into the modern era with Reagan, Bush, Obama, where the term gets really weaponized.
Right. We're basically tracing how this idea of being a spiritual beacon, something that was meant to be about internal purity, somehow transforms into this global interventionist doctrine.
Before we jump in, we should probably establish a formal definition, right? What exactly are scholars talking about when they say American exceptionalism?
That's a great place to start. So formally, it's defined by this whole basket of unique features. Things like religious liberty, political freedom, republicanism, individualism, democracy.
Laissez-faire economics, social mobility, all the classic aspirational ideals.
Exactly. But here's the really fascinating part, the paradox that most people don't know, the origin of the term itself.
You're talking about Joseph Stalin. This is such a great piece of historical trivia. It just sounds so unbelievable.
It does, but it's true. He basically invented it as an insult.
So what happened?
Well, back in the 1920s, the leader of the American Communist Party, a guy named J. Lovestone, he suggested that America's path to a communist revolution might be, delayed. It's different from Europe's.
Because of its prosperity.
Because of its prosperity, its lack of a feudal past, all those unique factors. And when Stalin heard this idea that America might deviate from the historical past laid out by Marx, he was apparently furious.
He didn't like exceptions to the rule.
Not at all. He basically ordered Lovestone to stop this heresy of American exceptionalism. So for Stalin, the term meant an aberration. It was America being an unwelcome exception to the global rule of communist revolution.
It is just. The irony is incredible. The very phrase that's now a banner for American superiority was coined by its greatest ideological enemy to describe its failure to conform.
The irony is rich, isn't it? And it just tells you how contested this idea has been from the very beginning.
Okay, so let's start at that beginning, the absolute genesis, the Puritan theological project. I feel like to understand any of this, you have to get the gravity of John Winthrop's 1630 sermon.
A model of Christian charity. You absolutely have to start there. He delivers the sermon on the ship, the Arbella, while they're sailing to Massachusetts Bay.
And these are people who felt they had failed, right? They'd given up on reforming England from within.
Completely. They saw the old world as lost, so their goal in the new world wasn't economic, not primarily, it was spiritual. They were there to build a covenant community.
The city upon a hill.
The city upon a hill, which is a direct quote from the Sermon on the Mount in the Bible. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Their whole project was to be a spiritual model for a failing Europe, a new Jerusalem.
It's like a reenactment of the Exodus story.
Yeah.
They saw themselves as the new Israel, and America was their promised land. This wasn't just another colony.
No, it was a theological project. And that word you used, covenant, is so important. It was a contract with God. And this is why initially the focus was on what scholars call exemplarism.
Meaning they just had to be a good example.
A perfect example. Their mission was to be a pure, shining beacon of piety. It wasn't about spreading out or conquering anything. It was about getting their own house in perfect order. Winthrop's warning was terrifying. He said if they failed, they would be made a story and a byword through the world.
So spiritual survival or global humiliation, the stakes were high.
Immensely high. But here's a crucial point. A lot of recent scholarship suggests that later historians kind of ran away with this text.
What do you mean?
Well, the idea that Winthrop's speech was the founding document of an expansionist America, a mandate to take over the continent of the world, that was largely a reinterpretation that happened much, much later.
During the Cold War, right?
Exactly. That's when politicians and historians started reframing the city upon a hill idea. It went from being this contained moral model to being a justification for an aggressive global foreign policy. The original Puritans probably had much more modest ambitions.
They just wanted a place to be left alone to practice their faith.
Pretty much. They wanted to uphold their covenant, free from European interference. That distinction between being an example and being a crusader is really the pivot point for this whole story.
And it connects so directly to another deep root in this identity, which is the early link between Puritan thought and Christian Zionism.
The connection is immediate and it's foundational. The Puritans were, well, they were highly philo-Semitic, which means they were very pro-Jewish, especially compared to, say, Lutherans at the time.
They were obsessed with the Old Testament.
Completely. They saw it as their instruction manual for everything. Morality, politics, law. They named their kids Abraham, Sarah, Isaac. They grounded their entire self-identity in that narrative of being a chosen people, the new Israel, fleeing a modern-day Egypt.
Which brings us to the persistence of this thinking. I mean, it helps explain that story I mentioned at the start about my friend's conversation with that older gentleman.
Elias, right. His perspective is so critical to understanding this. For him, America wasn't a political accident. It was a theological covenant.
He saw the West not as a place on a map, but as a spiritual lineage going all the way back to the Arbella.
And so when he sees protests against Western civilization, he's not hearing a political debate. He's hearing a threat to a divine narrative. For him, if the New Zion apologizes for itself, it's not just a policy change, it's breaking a sacred contract with history.
It explains why some of these political debates feel like spiritual warfare to people.
Right.
Because for them, that's exactly what it is. Their core identity is at stake.
And that identity, for many, is tied up with specific ideas about the restoration of Israel.
Right. This is where Christian Zionism comes in. To really get it, you have to trace how Christian thinking about Jewish people changed over the centuries.
For most of Christian history, the main doctrine was something called supersessionism.
Okay, let's break that down. Supersessionism.
It's also called replacement theology. It's the belief that the Christian church has replaced Israel as God's chosen people, that the church inherited all the promises and covenants that were once made to the Jewish people.
And this idea basically dominated for centuries.
It did. It was established very early on, and it provided the theological justification for a lot of the anti-Jewish sentiment in the medieval church. There was very little interest in a literal, physical return of Jewish people to Israel.
So where did that idea come from then, if the church was so against it?
Well, it was rare, but you had these little glimmers. There was a Franciscan prophet in the 14th century, John of Rupasisa, who argued for a literal return and rebuilding of Jerusalem. He was taking Old Testament prophecies literally when almost everyone else was reading them as allegory. But he was an outlier.
The real shift came with the Reformation.
Absolutely. The Reformation's greatest gift in this context was putting the Bible into the language of the people. This led to this explosion of personal and very literal interpretation, especially of the Old Testament prophets.
So people started reading those prophecies about a return to Zion and thinking, hey, maybe this is meant to happen for real.
That's it. And while the first big reformers like Luther and Calvin didn't really support it, English Protestant theologians ran with it. By 1609, you have Thomas Brightman declaring, What? Shall they return to Jerusalem again? There is nothing more certain.
And this wasn't just some abstract theological debate. It got political and dangerous very quickly in England.
Very dangerous. Take the case of Henry Finch in 1621. He insisted on a literal reading of prophecies about Israel's return and their eventual rule over other nations. The English crown saw this as a massive political threat.
So they came after him.
He was arrested, stripped of his reputation, lost everything. But the Puritan movement, which was already looking to create its own New Zion in America, fully embraced this restorationist theology. Great Puritan thinkers like John Owen wrote plainly that the Jews shall be gathered and brought home into their homeland. It just became part of the spiritual DNA of America.
Which brings us all the way to modern Christian Zionism, where these theological ideas translate directly into foreign policy.
Yes. Christian Zionism today is really about political action. It's informed by these very specific literalist Christian beliefs, and it's undertaken to promote or preserve Jewish control over the territory of Israel and Palestine.
And at its core is this absolute biblical literalism, a rejection of any kind of allegory.
And this belief that the modern state of Israel is, and this is a common phrase, God's stopwatch for everything. The idea that global events are dictated by a prophetic timeline that centers on that specific piece of land.
The ethical problem, as many see it, is that this can frame the Jewish people as just a means to an end in a Christian theological story.
That's the core of the critique. The focus shifts away from the actual human communities living there, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and it becomes all about the territory as this abstract symbol that has to fulfill a theological destiny.
And that's the danger, right? When you combine that kind of religious literalism with the military might of a superpower.
It's incredibly dangerous. It can fuel extremism on all sides because the focus is no longer on human justice or peace. It's on making sure your ideology manifests itself, even if it's through conflict.
It makes foreign policy decisions almost sacred. How can you compromise on a policy if you believe it's a divine imperative?
You can't. Retreating from a policy feels like breaking your covenant with God, and that's the invisible foundation that so much of this is built on.
Okay, so we have this contained spiritual model from Winthrop, exemplarism. At some point, that model breaks, and America starts looking outward. How did the nation justify going from a small experiment to, well, continental conquest?
Well, the break was ideological at first. The Founding Fathers themselves, people like Washington and Adams, were actually very wary of expansionism.
Washington's farewell address.
Right.
He warned against foreign entanglements.
Exactly. He said the great rule of conduct for us is to have with Europe as little political connection as possible. For them, exceptionalism meant staying neutral, staying apart. John Adams was even more direct, warning against the spiritual arrogance of thinking you're the chosen people.
They wanted to be a beacon, but not a crusader.
They feared the moral corruption that comes with empire, but the internal pressures, demographic, economic, they were just too strong. Settlers started moving west, and they needed a justification.
And they found one?
They did. They started using John Locke's ideas about natural law to argue that indigenous lands were basically a blank slate, a tabula rasa, or wastelands that needed to be improved. It was this mix of anti-Catholic bias and a so-called mandate to multiply the value of the land.
Which became the justification for displacement and conquest. And by the mid-1800s, this whole drive gets a name.
Manifest Destiny. Coined in 1845 by a journalist, John O'Sullivan, he argued that it was America's inevitable and providential mandate from heaven to expand across the continent.
And this wasn't just a political slogan for them.
No, they saw it as a righteous, unavoidable march of a chosen people. It justified everything. The Louisiana Purchase, taking Florida, annexing huge parts of Mexico, it was all seen as part of God's plan.
And then the historian Frederick J. Turner comes along and gives this an academic gloss with his frontier thesis.
Right. Turner basically argued that the American character itself, democracy, individualism, self-reliance, was forged in the hardship of moving west. That the frontier is what physically and mentally unshackled America from the old, rigid ways of Europe.
So expansion wasn't just a land grab, it was the act of creating American democracy itself.
It elevated it to a foundational myth. And you see how the messianic drive doesn't go away. It just secularizes. It morphs from a theological mission to save souls into a political mission to spread democracy.
This reminds me of that story about Sarah, the former USAID director. She was an atheist, but she had the same crusading spirit.
Her story is the perfect example of this. She described being in a local council meeting in Central America, demanding transparency and universal rights and moral accountability with this this fiery conviction of a preacher.
And she had this moment of self-awareness, that she was basically preaching a secular sermon.
She said the city upon a hill hadn't disappeared, it just changed its curriculum. The spiritual covenant became a contract for good governance, and a local elder actually called her on it. He said, "You Americans don't bring Bibles anymore, but you still preach sermons. You still believe you are the only ones who know the path to salvation."
That's chilling. The convert or perish mentality is still there, just under the surface.
It's embedded in this modern progressive desire to fix other countries by demanding they adopt U.S. standards, as if those standards are a universal historical imperative.
So if Manifest Destiny took this impulse across the continent, Woodrow Wilson is the one who takes it global.
He's the turning point. Before 1917, U.S. policy was still mostly about isolationism. Wilson transforms exceptionalism into an explicit, messianic global mission.
He rejects that whole European model of power politics, right?
Completely. He insists America has a moral obligation to spread its principles. He frames entering World War I not as a strategic choice, but as a moral crusade for democracy.
And his 14 points become the blueprint for this.
They're revolutionary. Wilson basically says America can't just be an isolated beacon anymore. It has to be the active creator of a new world order. And here's the crucial leap he makes. He says there's no substantial difference between freedom for the U.S. and freedom for the entire world.
The idea that what's good for America is universally good for everyone.
And must be exported. That's the birth of liberal internationalism and the whole theory of democracy promotion that has driven U.S. foreign policy ever since. He unleashes that Puritan messianic impulse onto the entire global stage.
Which brings us to the Monroe Doctrine, because its history is this perfect case study of that shift, that collision between the ideal of defensive isolationism and the reality of this expansionist crusade.
Absolutely. Let's look at what it was supposed to be when President James Monroe announced it in 1823.
It was rooted in that early idea of non-entanglement from Washington.
It was purely defensive. It established separate spheres of influence for the Americas and Europe, non-colonization, non-intervention. It was a shield to protect the new, fragile republics in Latin America.
A shield against who, specifically?
Primarily against the Holy Alliance in Europe. Russia, Prussia, Austria. They were all about monarchical, autocratic rule, and Monroe was worried they might try to recolonize South America. So the doctrine was just a big keep-out sign aimed at Europe.
But that keep-out sign started to look more like a deed of ownership pretty quickly.
Almost immediately. By the mid-1800s, it gets fused with Manifest Destiny. Suddenly, it's being used to justify U.S. territorial expansion. The goal shifts from protecting the hemisphere to asserting America's unique right to the hemisphere.
And the enforcement was so selective.
Yeah.
Which is the great irony.
It really was. The U.S. would ignore blatant European violations if they didn't directly threaten its own interests. They turned a blind eye when Britain took the Falklands in 1833, or when France invaded Mexico in the 1860s. It was a principle of convenience.
The moment the shield officially becomes a sword is with Theodore Roosevelt, though.
The Roosevelt Corollary in 1904, that's the definitive decay. Monroe said Europe can't intervene. Roosevelt said, actually, the U.S. can and must intervene unilaterally in Latin America.
If those countries were deemed unstable.
And still are fiscally irresponsible. And this becomes the big stick policy. It's the justification for intervention after intervention. Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua. It's not isolationism anymore. It's unilateral paternalism.
This is exactly what that diplomat Thomas was talking about. Realizing the U.S. had built a wall to keep the wolves out, only to become the wolf inside the house.
That image of rearranging the furniture in someone else's house is so powerful. The U.S. claimed responsibility for managing the whole hemisphere based on this assumed moral and political superiority. It's the Puritan impulse all over again.
And this paternalism just goes into overdrive during the Cold War.
The Monroe Doctrine becomes the explicit justification for massive interventions. It was all about securing the hemisphere as a U.S. sphere of influence and wiping out any perceived Marxist threat. This leads directly to things like Plan Condor.
We should spend a minute on that, because for a long time, Plan Condor was dismissed by many as a conspiracy theory.
The reality is just chilling. It was a coordinated campaign of state terror and political repression by right-wing military dictatorships across South America, and it was carried out with extensive, undeniable help from U.S. intelligence agencies.
Kidnappings, torture, disappearances.
All systematically coordinated across borders, and the proof eventually came out. The big turning point was in 1992, with the discovery of the Archivos del Terror, the Archives of Terror in Paraguay.
What was in them?
Hundreds of thousands of documents from the dictator Stroessner's intelligence agency, detailed records that confirm the cross-border cooperation and the deep involvement of U.S. intelligence in training and supporting these regimes.
And this discovery had real-world consequences back in the U.S.
It did. It forced an acknowledgement of the role played by places like the School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, which had trained so many of the officers who went on to commit these atrocities. The public outcry was so great they had to rename it WinSec, just to try and create some distance from that history.
So today, that same impulse to control the hemisphere is still there, but the enemy has changed. It's less about communism and more about, well, China.
The focus has definitely pivoted to the Pacific and to counterbalancing China's growing presence in Hispano-America, which has been strengthening since China joined the WTO.
But China's approach is different, isn't it? It's not the same kind of military imperialist model.
It's very different. It's driven by a strong technological impulse. Their expansion is focused on securing resources and establishing commercial corridors in the Pacific. It's primarily economic and infrastructural.
And it's aimed at challenging what you called Anglo-Saxon thalassocracy.
Thalassocracy just means maritime power, a state whose power is based on controlling the seas. For centuries, that's been an Anglo-American strength. China's focus on building ports and infrastructure is a long-term strategic play to shift those global maritime routes and challenge that traditional dominance.
But the U.S. still frames its response in those familiar, moral, exceptionalist terms.
It does. Even when the competition is about technology and resources, the justification for U.S. policy often defaults back to that core belief in its unique democratic mission.
So after World War II, you have this consensus. But then the idea of exceptionalism takes a huge ideological hit after Vietnam.
Vietnam just shatters that consensus.
Yeah.
You have major intellectuals saying the belief in exceptionalism has vanished, gets replaced by a policy of détente, just easing tensions with the Soviet Union. The whole idea starts to look hypocritical, delusional.
And the Carter administration that followed was seen by many as a symbol of that decline.
Especially with the Iran hostage crisis. The perception was one of weakness, of impotence. And when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, détente collapsed, and Carter's whole approach of multilateral cooperation was seen as a failure of nerve.
Which created the perfect opening for Ronald Reagan to come in and resurrect the whole idea.
He brings it roaring back, and he does it by consciously going back to John Winthrop. He starts talking about the shining city on a hill. Again, not as a metaphor, but as a literal description of America's mission.
He reframes the Cold War not as a geopolitical chess match, but as a moral struggle between good and evil.
His Evil Empire speech in 1983 is the peak of this. He's not making a strategic argument, he's making a theological one. The Soviet Union is the focus of evil in the modern world, and America has a sacred duty to oppose it. It's exceptionalism with an unapologetic religious purpose.
Then we get to the post-Cold War era, and after a brief moment of triumphalism, 9/11 happens, and the Bush Doctrine is born.
And all that post-Cold War restraint is just thrown out the window. The Bush administration fully embraces this aggressive expansionism, and it's fueled by this idea of historical eschatology.
Okay, let's define that. Eschatology is about the end times, right?
In theology, yes. Historical eschatology is the secular version. It's the belief that history is moving toward a predetermined endpoint, in this case, the global triumph of American-style democracy, and that the U.S. is the agent chosen to make that happen. 9/11 just validated their belief that they had to force history's hand.
And the Bush Doctrine laid out the strategy for doing that. What were its main pillars?
There were four. First, consolidate U.S. global preeminence and stop any competitor from rising. Second, adopt a preemptive strategy, the right to strike threats before they emerge. Third, assert the right to act unilaterally. And fourth, make democracy promotion a core weapon in the war on terror.
This is where we see the rise of the darkest version of exceptionalism, isn't it? What's called exemptionalism.
Yes. Exemptionalism is the malignant variant. If exceptionalism is believing you're unique, exemptionalism is believing that because you're unique and on a moral mission, you are exempt from the international rules and laws that apply to everyone else.
Because your cause is so righteous, it puts you above the law.
Precisely. And we saw concrete examples of this, declaring parts of the Geneva Convention obsolete for terror suspects, withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol on climate change and from the International Criminal Court Treaty. It was a deliberate policy of setting the U.S. apart from and above global norms.
This all leads into the Obama years, where the term itself becomes this political football.
Obama was very cautious with it at first. I remember he was asked about it in Europe, and he gave this very diplomatic answer saying, "I believe in American exceptionalism, just as I suspect that the Brits believe in British exceptionalism."
And conservatives just pounced on that.
Immediately. It became a political bludgeon, a litmus test for patriotism. People like Mike Huckabee said that to deny American exceptionalism was to deny the heart and soul of this nation. It got so intense that even Vladimir Putin wrote an op-ed criticizing Obama for using the term, saying it was dangerous.
So Obama had to shift his language.
He did. Later in his presidency, he started embracing it more openly, saying, "I believe in American exceptionalism with every fiber of my being," but, and this is a crucial but, he attached a warning against exemptionalism. He said, "We cannot exempt ourselves from the rules that apply to everyone else. That's not leadership, that's retreat."
He was trying to find a balance. To reclaim the virtuous side of it while rejecting the malignant side.
He was the first president to really try and wrestle with that tension openly, to balance the ideal of moral leadership with a realist acknowledgement of its limits.
So after this whole journey, we can really boil it down to three distinct strands of this idea that have been competing with each other for centuries.
I think so. You have, first, exemplarism. That's the original Winthrop and Washington idea.
Yeah.
A shining beacon, a moral example. It's about what America is.
Then you have the second one, expansionism.
Right. The aggressive messianic impulse, the belief that you're a chosen people who have to go out and spread democracy. That's Manifest Destiny, Wilson, Reagan. It's about what America does. And we should note, it has a terrible track record. The success rate of imposing democratic regimes is historically below 30%.
Because it's a one-size-fits-all model born out of a very specific history.
Exactly. And finally, you have the third strand, exemptionalism, the malignant version, where you believe you're above the rules. That's the Bush Doctrine in its purest form.
So where does that leave American exceptionalism today? It seems to be facing more skepticism, both globally and internally, than ever before.
It is. The rise of powers like China and Russia, combined with America's own internal problems, the political polarization, the inequality, it's made the whole idea much harder to sell. That dogmatic self-focus just doesn't work in a multipolar world.
And it creates this paradox of hubris, doesn't it? If you truly believe your intentions are always pure, you can't understand why other people are alarmed by your actions.
You can't. You interpret any critique as either ignorance or malice. It makes it almost impossible to admit mistakes or learn from them because you believe the mission itself is divinely sanctioned.
But despite all that, the idea persists. It's still this incredibly potent force in American politics.
Because those deep, secularized, messianic roots are still there, they provide what you could call a sacred canopy of theopolitical validation. It elevates policy debates beyond the realm of rational critique. If a policy is sacred, it's not up for negotiation.
And that framework is built on a foundational myth that, as some scholars have pointed out, has a very dark side, a justification for violence woven into its very fabric.
The drive for the New Zion is not just history. It's this invisible gravity that's still shaping global strategy today, giving a kind of moral weight to decisions about trade, defense, and intervention that goes way beyond simple economics or security.
So we've really traced this 400-year journey. We started with this idea that foreign policy might actually be a secularized crusade rooted in 17th century Puritanism. We went from Winthrop's contained city upon a hill to the expansion of Manifest Destiny, Wilson's global moral crusade, and then the modern political weaponization of the concept.
It's been a dramatic migration, hasn't it? From a spiritual ideal to a powerful and sometimes very corrosive political tool. You know, if you look at the whole arc of this history, the real strength of the American identity might not be in the expansion or the exemption. It might be in its long-standing, often very painful, ability to self-correct and adapt, to learn from the world. Because at the end of the day, nations are made by the people who live in them and their capacity for change.
It's a powerful reminder that history, and especially foreign policy, is rarely just about maps and money. It is so often about the lingering shadows of old sermons. We have covered a lot of ground today, and hopefully we've given you a new framework for seeing those shadows.